Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with a global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff. We have to apologize here for a minute. This is kind of a new experience taking over from someone, a previous show. We haven't had to do that yet. So if things are a little off kilter, it will be back on kilter in just a few minutes. So
yes,
work with us here.
We hope we're back on kilter now.
Yeah.
Thank you for tuning in to Voices of Resistance. As you listen, please share your thoughts, ideas, and questions with us on our Facebook page or send us an email to voicesofresistance@gmail.com. Our guest host today is Monifa Johnson. Monifa, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners and let them know a little bit about you?
Hi, my name is Monifa Johnson. I'm a native of the city of Savannah. I have been involved with advocating for human equality for pretty much all of my adult life. I was trained by the anti-racist, anti-oppressive, multicultural methodology by Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training and by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. For more than 15 years, I've conducted trainings and workshops on the topic of racism to numerous organizations, and that includes the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Catholic Diocese of Savannah, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, Southeastern Synod, the Interracial Interfaith Community, Step Up Savannah's Neighborhood Leadership Academy.
Thank you, Monifa. That's great. You are so well qualified to be here today with us to talk about racism, and thank you for being our guest co-host. And also encouraging us to watch a few videos on YouTube called Race, the Power of Illusion. I certainly encourage our listeners to find those on YouTube and watch them. I understand there may also be copies in the public library. So I think we should get right to our conversation with Monifa. And the first thing I'd like to ask you is, what does racism mean to you? What is it? How would you define it?
Okay. Racism, not specifically defined by me, but there is a definition of racism that people who are in the anti-racism movement internationally have adopted, and that is race prejudice plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions. So we're trying to make sure that people, when they're discussing racism, share a same definition, or at least can accept that definition for the purposes of the conversation at that time. Because what we find is that when people come to the table with various definitions of racism, it's very difficult to have a conversation. And one of the things that contributes to that difficulty is that people look into the Webster's Dictionary to find a definition for racism, and it's not the one that we're using. So across people who are working in anti-racism, anti-oppression methodologies have systematically decided that the definition for racism would be something that involved power as well as the personal prejudice that people have. One of the things that becomes a surprise is that for a lot of people is acknowledging that every human being is prejudiced. But not every human being has the potential of coupling their prejudices with other people's prejudices, and therefore creating a power dynamic where those prejudices are elevated as the norm, and then everyone else is the other. And that's what systemic oppression looks like. And then when you use that, if race is the thing that you're utilizing as the measure, then that's where you have the racism. So understanding the definition as racial prejudice, and that's a personal prejudice, plus the misuse of power by people, institutions, you then can actually start framing the word in a way that people can use it in a what I think is a more fruitful conversation.
Thank you very much for that. So an individual, I could say, I'm a racist, but in fact what I am is taking my personal prejudice and misusing power toward people of a different group, and that can become racism.
Well, but you don't have to do it. That's the thing about systems and institutions. The systems and institutions can decide for you And you just being born into a privileged group by default gives you that, gives you the privilege in that society, and therefore you don't have to do it at all. There's not something that you have to consciously do, and I think that's what throws a lot of people off as well. People don't perceive themselves as racist, but by the Webster's definition, or by what people typically want to believe is the stereotype of a racist, which would be the Ku Klux Klan or people with the neo-Nazis. That's the easier paradigm to put in that context, to put a person in that context. But again, if you're looking at the misuse of power by systems and institutions, the systems and institutions labeling you in a certain way where you are benefited over other people, then if you're not consciously working against that, then that's where that definition comes in. And people get a little uncomfortable because, a lot of people perceive themselves to be good. And we're not trying to make it a good or bad situation. We're trying to get people to look at it as a systemic issue and how to address a systemic issue, and not take it and make it so personal to you, because everyone has prejudices. Not everyone has the power to place their prejudices above everyone else.
Okay. And that is true. We're all guilty of that. You once I was in a class that you addressed, and you once made a distinction between racism and bigotry that really hit me hard, because it brought things to a forefront that I had never confronted before. The difference. I always assumed a bigot is a racist is a bigot, but you had a clear definition between the two. Can you outline that a bit?
Well, bigots.
Other than what you just did.
Well, bigots are prejudice.
Yeah.
So that's people who are, basically acting out in their personal prejudice. And you have bigots in all hues. So everyone has personal prejudices that they are dealing with. And if you want to be a good person, then you're working on your personal prejudices. The difficulty is that in working on your personal prejudices, and some people think they can deal with racism by just doing the kumbaya work. We on a one-on-one basis will meet and, people and reach out and touch someone and know their story and get to befriend people and have dinners together, and they think that that's going to work in solving racism.
Well, that's not going to solve it.
Well, it hasn't so far. And people and there's been a concerted effort by individual people to try to reach across ethnic groups and trying to create friendships and relationships, and to really dig deep into creating authentic relationships. But the flip side is that it doesn't do anything to deal with the systems and institutions, which are also incidentally made up of people who, it's interesting when you step into your position within a system or institution, into your job, how you completely transform to the rules and regulations and the policies and procedures of those institutions, which may not be what you personally believe, but it's what you do for a living and how you pay the bills. And therefore you are still perpetuating those systems and institutions, and the systems and institutions kind of take a life of their own, and that's a cross ethnic group as well, because who makes the decisions and how were these institutions founded, and on what principles were the foundations laid for those systems and institutions? And that's some of the work that people are having to do to basically uncover and make sure that they understand how these systems and institutions were developed and for what purpose. Who were they built initially to serve? And how do you then transform those same institutions whose historical legacy was to serve maybe one group, and then you're going to transform it to serve another?
And that group is not always a racial construct. It can also be an economic construct. Like in the founding of this country, I couldn't vote, because I certainly was not landed nor part of the gentry. And if you didn't, it didn't matter the color at that point in time. Well, it did, but I mean, I was in the same boat. I couldn't vote.
Well, that's an intersectionality. That's what we call where things start intersecting. And that's a separate conversation from racism.
Right.
Yeah, because it certainly wasn't because of racism that I couldn't do it.
Well, but as I said, that's a separate conversation.
Yeah.
That's a separate conversation.
So it sounds like, in addition to looking into ourselves to see our prejudices, our bigotry. We also need to be understanding how our privilege has shaped the institutions and how the institutions are using their power to further give certain groups privilege and take it away from others.
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is that people need to accept that some people have privileges and other people don't, because I don't think that's a commonly held view in this society either. So that's the first place to start.
Well said. Yes, well said. I agree completely. We were looking a little bit at why it is that we allow institutional racism to exist, why we allow this system to perpetuate itself. I mean, so many years, we're becoming aware. Do you have any sense of that?
We are conditioned. We are conditioned to believe the world works a certain way. And that conditioning starts at a very young age. And so when you're conditioned not only by the systems and institutions as far as public education, college, the jobs you take, but you're also conditioned, from your family and friends about who teaches you the way the world is. And so there's a conversation to be had. There's a point in the training that that I'm familiar with, the 2.5-day training on racism, where there's a point in that training where white people are separated out and people of color are separated out to have separate conversations. Well, for a large group of people, that's difficult because, especially for people from the civil rights generation, it's a hard moment because for that generation, for people who were fighting against segregation to be integrated, the idea that you're going to segregate out again is very difficult for them. For my generation, and I went to all integrated schools, so it's not a difficult thing for me to understand that it doesn't have the same emotional impact for me to have the separate conversations, and I can intellectually see that there are some conversations that need to be had amongst white people. There's the conversations about who's in these postcards and pictures from all of these lynchings. Was that your great granddaddy that was in the, do you really want to have that conversation in front of me? If that does give you pause, if that's a family secret, do you really want to have that conversation in front of people of color? Mm-hmm. And from what I gather from people from the trainings that I've attended and participated in and facilitated, there are a lot of white people who don't have those conversations at all. So if you're going to start to deal with that, the first place I think where people would be more comfortable as they become more aware is for white people to start having those conversations amongst white people. Did your people own slaves? That's not a very comfortable conversation. Look at how Ben Affleck responded.
There have been quite a few that way.
But it's a legitimate conversation in this country, and a lot of people don't have it, and they're not comfortable having it. So there's a lot of work for everyone to do, and some of that work, I think, is going to be, with white people are going to need to work with each other as they start dealing or grappling with that issue. And then there's work for people of color as well.
I was in the class of 64 at Savannah High School, which was the first class to be integrated. Mm-hmm. We had over 700 students just in the graduating class. The school was, probably about 2,000, a little over 2,000 students. That's a lot of students. And for 12 students to walk in to that school, bravery. I've met some of them since then. Mm-hmm. And it's really, I'm impressed and amazed that they had that courage. But at the same time, you're right, we did not have the conversations then. We knew nothing about it. My family never talked about it. I asked one time, did we own slaves? I didn't get an honest answer. I honestly think some family did and some didn't. But the majority of people, of course, would have to answer no. But it doesn't matter because we still maintain the same system. We support it.
Well, you don't have to just have owned slaves. Yeah. The entire economy was based upon enslaving people and the products that enslaved people produced. And if you don't have to even go back as far as the antebellum period. When you talked about your school getting integrated, anybody terrorize some of those young people?
Oh, yes.
And carry guilt about that? And I'll be the first one to admit guilt is not productive. I'm not here to make anybody feel guilty. But if you're concerned about trying to create a better world. People want to talk about creating that beloved community. Well, part of that work is that white people are going to have to sit with each other and start talking and being real about what they know, what they're aware of, because they're in those circles. People of color can't conceive of some of the things that are happening in some areas of even this city where there are only whites at the table and we don't know what's going on there and there's no one to tell us. So we're not privy to some information. So and some decision making that's been a long time tradition in parts of this community. So again, people of conscience are going to have to start having those conversations. I'm not in a position to talk to some of these people about that, but that's a real conversation people need to have. So you don't have to go back as far as whether or not your people own slaves. There's enough going on in modern society, and again, I think there are people who are carrying a lot of guilt about behaviors that they know that family members may have, things that they may be aware of that they don't talk about. Southerners are known for their secrets.
Absolutely.
And so and until people have a place where they can, speak and work through those things, how are they really an active ally for people either? So.
No, I grew up here.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I'm a Savannaian, and many of my family were not the family I liked. I'm the black sheep of the family, and I take that as a badge of honor with my family. But yeah, they were family members that couldn't talk honestly about anything. They were very proud that they were this way, and so that was part of the black sheep, because I always confronted them about it and said, "What's going on here?" And I was the different one. I was the one that was beaten up for being too involved in the issue, wanting to make changes or wanting to understand the situation, one that they didn't want to discuss. They had their view, and that was it.
And so then I encourage you to get with other white people like you, and y'all start having those conversations.
And we've tried that too. Mm-hmm. It works sometimes.
Well, it's hard work.
It is.
It's hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's especially hard work when you're talking with family. So up north, I don't know if we keep more secrets or less secrets than you Southerners, but I can tell you when I have tried to have these conversations with my family, and I come from a family of people who weren't exactly beloved from our European roots, but when I talk about privilege, and this is very true across the board, I will get stories, from white people, well, we were poor and we this and we that, and I would say, but you don't understand. When I look at the fact that when I applied for a job, there may have been 10 people who applied for that job, and I may have been one of 3 white faces who got called back for a second interview. Those kinds of situations, which I wasn't aware of at the time, I'm just becoming aware of. And you're right, those are the conversations we need to have. We need to understand how our privilege, and the conversation we had about the Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill, and how it offered white people an opportunity to buy homes for practically nothing, accumulate wealth that they are now living on. They've passed on to their children and grandchildren, and it has created greater separations over the generations.
Sure.
My family benefited from it.
And also with that GI Bill, especially if you were in the South, which schools could you go to?
Right.
Yes.
With the opportunity, I know that Betsy DeVos was already corrected about the HBCU comment she made that those were the schools of the only choice,
right?
Yeah.
That people had, including the people using the GI Bill,
right? Mm-hmm. And up north, where we were just so much more dignified. We didn't have the white only and colored only and those kinds of things, but it was more insidious. I mean, I didn't grow up in a school that was segregated, but there was absolutely no people of color in the school I grew up in, and it wasn't by law. It was de facto. It was by the fact that people of color weren't really welcomed or allowed to get mortgages to live in my neighborhood.
Yep. Yeah. And that still goes on today. When you start talking about neighborhood schools again, even in this community, we still segregate by neighborhood, and so it's a difficult subject, and a lot of people don't want to talk about it. But I do think when we have more of these conversations, people maybe become more aware, and they're better able to start, having something more fruitful in the dialogue. And when we talk about the hard work for white people, it's hard work for black people just to walk the street.
Yes.
So again, I'm ready for white people to do some hard work because it's hard work just surviving when you're a person of color.
Yes, and we were talking earlier about a book that I had the opportunity to read that we did not bring with us today, about the hard work of being a slave, of being obedient because it was survival, and how that worked its way into people's DNA, to the point today where people may feel like, I have to behave so much better than other people because there's less room for error for me. When I drive my car, I better do everything right and give no excuse to be stopped. When I'm walking down the street, I just have to keep my head down and keep walking because somebody could say, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Why are you here? And
I'm not going to say that that people of color don't take on some of that. It is a part of, as you said, tendencies for survival, where people are trying to be 3 times, as good in order to try to stay off the radar and out of harm's way. But just one correction, people were enslaved. They were, so we're trying to make a distinction between slaves and being enslaved.
Good
distinction. And enslaved people employ different tactics to survive.
Yes.
And I don't think any of those tactics are obedience. It's just that they are doing what they have to do to survive. The greatest form of resistance was surviving. And if you look at some of the data from the colonial periods in the New World, you will see that in some parts of the New World, people were simply brutalized and used until they died. There was no expectation, especially in the Caribbean, that you were going to maintain a population, because they just worked you until you died and then brought a fresh crop in. So again, one of the greatest forms of resistance was to survive. But make no mistake, there were many rebellions and people fighting and running away. And if you look at that documentation, you will see that people they weren't quote unquote obedient. They were trying to survive the best way they could.
And I stand corrected. Thank you. Appreciate that.
I read about the the Caribbean in the sugarcane plantations, how brutal they were.
Yep.
Even more so than if there's a qualitative issue here. I mean, they were especially brutal, those sugarcane plantations. It was amazing when I read the book that I had to find it difficult to go from one chapter to the next chapter, because it's hard to imagine that people can actually treat people that way.
Well, it's not hard to imagine, because if you know enough about human history, people have treated people poorly and for differing reasons. War is hell is the quote, and in economics it can be the root of all evil as well, because if you analyze the antebellum period just based on the economies and understand that, although I believe people knew that the enslaved Africans were human, there's a toll that was taken upon, I think, people who enslaved the Africans, because I believe they knew they were human, and to what went into their psyche in order to the depths of their psyche in order to try to be in denial to the point that they could deny the humanity of people in order to use them for economic purposes. I mean, I don't know about that. That's another one of those conversations that, white people need to have. But
in history, they did exactly that. They valued less than human. But or part human.
But again, as I said, if you look at it from an economic standpoint and start analyzing the antebellum period from an economic standpoint, then you can see you have a rationale about why people were treated certain ways during certain time periods, and how the movement of the enslaved African people, why you had the influxes of people being transported in, what the end of the actual transatlantic slave trade did when they ended it. And then you had all of this basically procreation going on to create slaves or enslaved people to continue to perpetuate the movement or sale of individuals after the transatlantic. Once you couldn't bring any more people from the African continent, so once you couldn't move people across the seas, what occurred on land? There's a whole lot of history out there regarding the economics of the triangle trade, the economics of the colonies, and what kind of money was made and how it was made, and the various ways enslaved people were used, not just for labor, but as collateral and absolutely other ways. So,
and who made the money?
Absolutely.
Yes. Who made the money?
Yeah.
So we're going to stop for a minute. We're going to identify our station. This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We're Savannah Soundings, community radio with a global soul. And now we're going to have a few words from our sponsor and how you can get involved in an upcoming auction to benefit this station.
Donating and about the auction. Donations can be made now. For information on donation, contact Trent Kissinger at TAKISSINGER@gmail.com.
Thank you for staying with us during our promotions here. We are going to return to a conversation with Monifa Johnson on the topic of racism. And Monifa, you talked about economics and how that plays a role in the institution rearing its wicked head and the issue of racism being used to a greater extreme. Do you think things are getting better or worse these days?
Whether things are getting better or worse.
That's a rough one.
I know that. I know it's hard.
I don't know about that question. Better or worse compared to which time period? For this day and for this age, it's still rather tough what people have to deal with, and how they have to prepare their children, especially particularly children of color, for the world that they are walking into. I mean, when you're a 12-year-old playing with a toy gun, and you can be shot within 2 seconds of police coming, that's a dangerous world for children of color. And so I can't. That's a question I have a difficult time answering.
I would have to, if I were forced, I'd have to say yes. It's getting worse. It's not getting better because we have more potential now than this, and it's getting worse. The number of people that are being murdered by the police or harassed by the police, it doesn't seem to be lessening. It may soften a bit in some areas.
Well,
but I
saw
a meme the other day on my feed. It had two parents sitting down with their son, trying to tell them how to deal with the world. The white father was doing birds and bees, but the black father was doing police and guns and things. So,
well, but the thing is that you feel comfortable saying it's worse, and I'm a person of color saying that it's that's a hard question to answer, and I'm wanted to kind of gauge it based on which time frame. So it's interesting because, again, you're answering the question on behalf of people of color.
No, I'm actually on mine, actually.
Well, but what are you basing it on?
When I grew up, as of now.
But you weren't, when you grew up, you weren't a person of color.
No, I've never been.
So how can you answer the question?
I'm not answering it as a person of color, as a person and a citizen in what I see, the changes that I have seen. We went through a period where there was civil rights, there was voting rights. It seemed as if all this was going to be good. We were going to solve these problems, and I've seen it slowly being retracted, taken away, bit by bit. Even in the school systems in North Carolina that were being resegregated, not out of neighborhoods, but out of racism. bigotry and things that
But-
they were trying to work out of.
I'm going to take this as a teachable moment, and I'm just
Good, 'cause
going
I
to.
need it.
I'm going to, and I'm glad you're open.
Oh yeah.
Because the thing is, when you ask a person of color about whether or not racism is getting better or worse, that's a distinctly different perspective. Because remember the definition, and remember
Systemic.
and remember who has privilege. So when a person that by the systems and institutions is considered to be privileged within that structure, then answers the question when a person of color who is considered to have been, and I hate using this word, but victimized by the systems institutions is reluctant to answer that question, then there's a little nuance there that I think is getting missed.
Don't you think that's part of the problem?
Well, again, your
That
eagerness.
we are doing that.
Well,
as
your
a fight.
but your eagerness to answer the question for me is, I think, an example of, as I said, that's a privilege.
That's what
It's
I
a
was trying to
privilege. So
say. And I agree.
That's very true. So because we had a little screw up on the board and we did not get to listen to a message from our actual sponsor of the program, we are going to do that now.
This portion of WRUU LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Brighter Day Natural Foods, offering produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
Thank you for staying with us during that break. And we're going to continue our conversation on racism with Monifa Johnson, who is our guest co-host today. So we're talking a lot about having these hard conversations, and it's very important for white people to have these conversations within groups of other white people, and for people of color also to have the conversations. Are there opportunities here in Savannah for those kinds of things to happen in a structured way?
Well, I know for people of color, we have those conversations in structured ways all the time.
How so?
Every black family has these conversations to a certain degree. As I said, even when they're equipping their children with how to, as you referenced before, how to behave, quote unquote, in public,
Right.
how to conduct themselves so that they potentially don't, potentially are not targeted, or that they can stay as innocuous as possible. They're not, drawing
Right.
the attention of anyone. So those conversations occur now. I do know that there have been attempts and groups that have met in this community. Interracial interfaith community was actually a group institution, a group of folks that came together, 501c3, and they met and had a meal and tried to discuss racism for several years. And after, they had a long tenure, but after a while, things, other things got in the way, and people started dropping out. And that's one of the things you'll find that occurs in this community. You'll have a group of folks, goodwilled, want to come to the table and start doing this work, realize how hard this work is, and try to, give it the good old college try for a while. But then eventually, people kind of take that knowledge and start on the journey individually and kind of fit it into their lives where they can or where it's convenient for them. A concerted effort to actually do training and organizing on a regular level in this community, I have not found. That's continued. Yeah, that's continuing today. So I don't know of a group that's continuing that from basically having an ongoing, organized approach to dealing with this topic.
Well, I in a way, it's disappointing. I feel like I have learned so much from you just in the short time talking, before the show, and certainly the videos you encouraged us to watch. And I feel like, in addition to having the sort of intra-group conversations, it would be a great opportunity to have the conversations in a mixed group. I appreciate hearing somebody say, "Don't talk on my behalf. Don't answer the questions for me." and pointing out the things that if I'm just sitting at a table with a bunch of other white people, it's just not going to happen.
Well, again, I think it's a both and proposition. And you have to remember, I've been engaged in this work for over 15 years, so nothing really gets me riled up. So, and for people who, when you start talking about having these conversations, until you have a critical mass of people who have, one, been trained, who are educated on the topic so that there can be a fruitful conversation, you first do no harm. You don't want people to come together with good intentions to start talking, to engage on this topic, and then everybody go away bruised. One of the saddest things I saw, and I think you remember Governor Sonny Perdue, he had a listening tour where he went around the state, several different locations, and Savannah, the Coastal Georgia Center, is where he had one of the a dialogue on race, and he had people come together. That the main room at the Coastal Georgia Center was filled to the rafters. People were standing on the sidelines. Evidently, a lot of people want to discuss race and racism. People are seeking some outlet to start trying to understand, and people well-intentioned across all, cultural lines want to come together and have a conversation. And there was a little bit of a dog and pony show, and people shared their stories. And when people start sharing personal stories, and I've said this in many places, I am reluctant to share any personal stories. I just don't do that. But people share their personal stories, and you could hear the pain and people seeking some type of answer or relief or reconciliation between people really wanting to work towards that. But there were no next steps that people were left with. There was no follow-up, and people were just left, after having poured out their hearts in this particular setting as a part of this dialogue, left hanging. And that's a painful thing for people. And how many times as a human being, when you're really seeking something from your heart to reconcile with people, to create that beloved community, or at least start really working towards it on one of the tougher topics within that, because there are a lot of things you're going to have to deal with to create a beloved community. But one of the topics, the tougher topics to start dealing with, people opening themselves up for that, and to be left hanging. How many times are you going to open yourself up for something like that? And when I tell you, there were probably a good 200 people in that room, to 300 people in that room. And again, no follow-up, no next steps, and it just dropped. So there are people who are interested, people who are willing, but again, organizing and trying to, keep a group engaged in doing that work. And as I said, even when you bring the larger groups, or when you bring a critical mass number of people together, there's still work people have to do individually, because they do need to get up to speed on history, because we don't need you being surprised in the middle of a debate by something, and you're saying it doesn't exist when there's enough documentation evidence that it does exist. And then those separate conversations, because everybody has to work through their emotional issues on the topic in order to then come together. And that needs to all occur before you actually start outlining an action plan to start dealing with the systems and institutions.
So how would you start that? Since the governor didn't do it and the program didn't, it was all dropped. How do we pick up the ball somewhere along the way here? Well,
again, for those who are willing, because I've done this workshop in several places locally. There have been groups that will start doing the work, and then other things take priority, and that's life. And what I have learned is that when people are interested, they will come, and I have always been open to just doing an introduction to start people on that road, and then we'll see how far down the rabbit hole people want to go. Again, I am a person of color, so and one of the things that in the trainings that I participated in, I need a counterpart that's just as knowledgeable as I am in order to actually, if you really want to engage in facilitating something locally. I need someone who's got a wealth of, knowledge and has done the work on themselves in order to train and do no harm. And again, we're not perfect. That doesn't mean everything's perfect. But again, with that being, there has to be a level of love for people, period, in order to try to engage in this relationship. Because the bottom line is, I strive for authentic relationships with people. I have several friends who tell me that that they love me and that they are my friend, but it was very difficult at times because, again, if you have not been introduced to this topic, I'm going to be authentic. I try to be me, whether or not the room's full of any color people there. Yeah, I'm going to be the same Monifa wherever I am. That's been my personal promise to myself. So again, some people don't. Some people, it takes a while for them to understand because I'm going to be the same. And what people have grown accustomed to, we're genteel and polite down here, and sometimes people interpret some of the things I say as not very genteel or polite. And I didn't say a swear word at all, Mama. But but sometimes, I will say things and people don't think it's the appropriate thing to say because we don't talk about that topic, or we don't engage in that conversation, or it's not the appropriate time to bring that up. So again, I need a counterpart, because people of color have been talking about racism since it started, and people get discredited and basically ignored, and it's very easy to do when you're privileged. So people ignore you, and I need a white counterpart who will co-train. And so that's one of the other things we're missing locally if we really want to organize and start doing this work. And a lot of people are calling it reconciliation work now because the word anti-racism or racism is too strong for people. So that race reconciliation is the new word I think a lot of people are using.
I don't particularly like that word as much. I really like to face the issue head on, and reconciliation is not working to solve the problem so much.
Well, there's a part that is reconciliation.
Oh, I understand that,
Yeah.
yes, but it's a part. But that's also included in the anti-racism or the racist issue. It's all part and parcel, but it seems to lessen the impact a bit when we talk about reconciliation.
Well, there's certain things, they say faith without works is dead.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Reconciliation without the dismantling of the institutions, one of the things that they say in the movement is diagnosis determines therapy. So therefore, you need to make sure that you diagnose a thing correctly. And if you're dealing with racism, that's where the definition really is key, and making sure that you're staying focused on that as you develop your therapy.
And the institutions that we work within has to change. How do we do that? Is this the city, for instance, or the county, or you said the governor came, so apparently it was his state plan or something. How do these institutions respond? Is Savannah City responding or doing enough or doing anything at all? I'm unaware, so I'm asking honestly.
As I said, I don't know of any effort that's an organized effort to undo racism that's funded by any of those locally. So
that's a shame.
But again, people prioritize and distribute resources based on what they perceived are important.
Profit a lot.
Well, again,
That's
or
true.
what they perceive is important.
Right. And if you're benefiting from the system the way it is, you may not perceive it's important to make any changes and direct resources to making those changes. I know. I hear what you're saying. And I feel at a loss, wanting very much to get to the next step. And, we've been watching a lot of things, reading a lot of books, talking to a lot of people, and it feels like it's time to try to dismantle some of these very harmful institutional practices, even some of the institutions, and not quite sure what to do and how to do it.
Well, one of the first things, and that's where we started with this, ally with other white people, again, to start addressing what can be done. Who has the power and the privilege?
Right.
Who benefits most in the society? And again, when I say these things, I'm not being flippant.
No,
I'm just
I
trying
understand.
because a lot of people who may be listening, there are people who are like, well, the coal miners aren't privileged. So again, the idea about what that privilege actually entails and what that means is, there was a joke that Chris Rock said in one of his concerts when on his tour. He was saying that there are people who wouldn't change places with him, and he's rich. So,
which is true,
which is true. But now, but the thing is, it's different in different generations. It was funny in my generation. I definitely, understood that joke. But you have a younger generation now that's much more multicultural. And so, again, it's not as funny for them because there might be some of them who would because they're much more multicultural. So as we enter into, an age where we are where people have, as I said, I was in the first generation that went to all integrated schools really in the South. You've got people who you've got the numbers of interracial relationships growing. You've got more acknowledgement of the LGBTQ community.
Absolutely.
You have more people in different fronts who are, basically coming out and showing that America's very diverse. So again, it's a more diverse there's more acceptance of some of the diversity in America. Now, is some of that, are we facing some times of people rolling back on that? I think there's a backlash to some of that, but again, we keep trying to move forward. Again, the intersectionality, and because racism is there as well, but again, that joke still, when we start talking about privilege and power in a society, again, it's going to mean different things generationally.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I never heard that joke, but it reminded me, I raised 2 boys, and I would often think about what it would be like to be a person of color raising 2 boys, with the drug trade out there, with so many things that these boys could have been lured into that my boys were not being lured into. And
well, if you were raised in Vermont or New Hampshire, what about the opioid?
That's right.
So again,
right, but I wasn't. I was part of I was in an inner city.
But
so,
what I'm speaking
to,
just there's a substance abuse issue across
oh,
America.
Right. Oh no, this isn't even abuse. This is the trade.
Well,
this is the selling.
And there's a substance abuse trade
Yes.
issue across the country.
Yes.
Again, that's not specific to young black boys, because again, you've got a serious opioid issue and a meth issue, and there's some other issues. So again, how we look at things in this country, again, we're conditioned, and that's one of the things when you start talking about what you can do. Again, it's your antennae has to be up. The more you read, the more you're aware. And there's a book, and I'm going to suggest this. You might want to write this down.
I will.
It's like the Dismantling Racism, the Continuing Struggle for White America, and it's by Joseph Barnt, Barndt. And again, it specifically deals with the racism as the systems and institutions, and the more you learn and you develop analysis, you will then be aware, even in when you are speaking about something, how you kind of you get into defaults that are created over time, that in how we approach information, even. So that when, you'll catch yourself when you start bringing up examples or things. But again, that does start with the individual kind of raising their awareness that we all have been conditioned over many, many years and to think in certain ways and to analyze information in certain ways. And we have to undo that work and then constantly be vigilant in order to make sure that when we start speaking about something, we catch ourselves before we default into some of those Memorex tapes that have just been ingrained, as practice over years, that we just have some things that the way we look at things sometimes are attributed to the way we've been conditioned.
That's very true. It seems like the more we learn, the more we realize we need to learn.
Absolutely.
Well, this conditioning starts. It starts in the home. You mentioned critical thinking earlier. Our thinking skills begin to be lessened and dulled in the home. When you start asking a lot of questions, why is this? Why is that? The first thing you thought, don't ask so many questions. Sit down, shut up. You go to school.
That depends on which home you grew up in now.
I'm sure. Mine was this way. And you go to school, you've got to walk on a certain side of the hallway. You've got to raise your hand for everything. You're taught not to question too much. There were some who did, but most people didn't. And when I tried to ask questions as to why things were, because I grew up in a time when we had the outward signs more so than today. We had the drinking fountains of different colors, and asked why one time. I never really got an answer on that, and all the things that we went to, everyone had to, it was just a different societal time. And I'm glad to see some of that has changed, but I see remnants of it even now. For some reason, I don't know why we can continue it.
Well, and as I said, that's a good conversation for that White Allies
And
group
we
that
say
you're
we
going
got
to
quite
start.
a bit here.
Yes, we
Quite a
do.
bit.
We're up all night.
Yeah. Well, we've got some allies that are
And
white,
there
so
are,
we
yeah.
need to start. Well,
Yeah.
you know some of them, so
Start having those conversations.
yeah, you know some of them. So.
Start having those
Pretty
conversations.
cool.
But one of the things I like to always bring up is that, especially during the antebellum period and even during the Jim Crow and segregation period, you had a lot of people of color, enslaved people during the antebellum period, and black people in the kitchens cooking, and you would mistreat people. And then you would let them cook your food and raise your children. And so, again, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. And to think that that there was no retaliation that was going on.
That is even more amazing, yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
And the thing is that retaliation doesn't have to take place in an outwardly aggressive way. But, the Southerners are known for that passive-aggressive nature.
One way or another.
One way or another.
Yeah, it's really important that we start talking. You're right on the among ourselves to start with.
Mm-hmm.
What are we really doing? Because I have a lot of friends who are very open and honest, but at the same time, we're on the wrong track. We're not working on the real problem. We've got all these things that we're talking about, but it's not the right issue. It's kind of like it's a sideline. And we feel good about that.
Well, remember,
we make
it's
ourselves feel good.
one of the things in this country is that we always tend to have a transactional situation.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody wins, somebody loses. The idea is to move away from that into a both-and proposition. Remember that as you're working on yourself, your understanding of the world, you're dealing with your defaults and conditioning, which would make you stronger in analyzing what's going on around you so that then you can be an ally and potentially work with others to dismantle institutions. Because understand, when it gets to the dismantling of the institutions, you can't do that by yourself. But again, you have to basically improve yourselves and your knowledge base and your awareness and your skill set at identifying what's going on around you in order to be an ally and be prepared to work towards that dismantling movement. So the book will help.
That's
Thank
good.
you.
We have several we discovered recently. One is on the housing, family housing, which was a very good book. We're just getting into it, and several others. I know that one of the things you brought up when I was asking questions, very honestly, why is this? Why is that? One of the things came up. My family was sharecroppers, so we were very poor, and of course, the neighbors down this way were black sharecroppers too. And my mother couldn't understand what the difference was. And I tried to tell her we could always leave. We had that privilege. And she never understood that. No, we were the same. Could have left too, but where would you go? You couldn't walk into town and immediately get a job that paid anything. You couldn't get the housing. You couldn't get the education. But being white, we could. And we did.
There are a lot of people of color, well, black people specifically in this case, that the Great Migration. Have you read The Warmth of Other Suns?
The Warmth of the Suns, yes.
A lot of people moved.
That.
They moved north. They moved west. They moved to the Midwest. And encountered difficulties there of a different kind. But there were a lot of people who did leave the South.
Yeah, that's true. And when I left Syracuse a year and a half ago, there were a lot of people who were talking about coming back, who were suddenly realizing it's not any better here, and at least I can get away from the snow and reunite with the family I left behind.
Yeah, that one of the things that the book deals with in The Warmth of Other Suns is what people gave up.
Yes.
In order to leave, in order to find opportunity to make money. I know that a lot of families, just being away, apart and away from each other to work, just to try to find work because they did not want to share crop.
Right.
And we're looking for more opportunities.
That's right. And now that we've lost the factories up north, there's very little opportunity, and people are saying, let's come back down south. So I think we have... it's time? Okay, well,
Unfortunately.
thank you so much to our listeners for this conversation. I know I learned an awful lot and have much more to learn, and we will definitely have more of this conversation as we move forward. I hope you will join us next week when we address issues of poverty and education with our guest, Wes Crenshaw. You've been listening to...
One of the things I want to say
Okay,
before we finish is
sorry.
when we wanted to do this show, I thought of no one that would do a better job or be more apropos than Monifa was. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I'd like to do it again
Yes.
in a later date.
Thank you for challenging us.
Thank you.
Thank you.